Thank you for inviting us to the SENIA Malaysia Neurodiversity meeting. My name's Martin Bloomfield.
And I'm Sandra Tibbles.
And we're from Beyond Inclusion. Beyond Inclusion works to create an inclusive educational environment around the world. This is a really interesting one. Some of the really common misconceptions about dyslexia is that dyslexics can't read.
Okay.
Often, not always, but often with dyslexia, there's something called phonological decoding. That's essentially the ability to turn the written word into sounds in your head. And that can be quite a struggle for many dyslexic people, but it doesn't mean that we can't read. At the same time, there's a common misconception in the UK that this means that languages such as the Malay language or Mandarin Chinese don't affect dyslexia because there's no phonological decoding, because they're not alphabetical.
Okay.
That's not true. That's not true. So that's another of the misconceptions about dyslexia. And then I'm afraid when I was at school, and still I see it in schools even today, there is this impression that dyslexic kids are lazy, they're not very intelligent, they're not very clever, dyslexic kids have got some kind of disease. So there are all these social misconceptions around dyslexia as well. So first of all, and probably the most obvious, is what we call executive functioning.
Yeah.
Now, executive functioning, I always explain this to people as, imagine that most people have got a secretary or a personal assistant living inside them.
Yeah.
Those with executive functioning challenges don't have that personal assistant or secretary living inside them. There are 4 general categories of executive function. These are problem orientation, task initiation, regulation, and
Working memory? Prime example.
Prime example. In school, what we find is that we give the kids a lot of homework, we give the kids a lot of tasks, and we don't break these tasks down into bite-sized chunks.
Yeah.
We give the kids so much to do that puts pressure on work, on executive function.
Yeah.
One of the classic things is we ask children to copy from a board. Now, copying things from a board is a classic example of pressure on working memory,
Yeah.
which is one of the main aspects of executive function. You have to look at the board, you've got to put things in your head, turn around, look at a piece of paper, remember what you're doing, put them onto the piece of paper, look back at the board, remember where you were, and then you've got to repeat the process. All the cognitive heavy lifting is going into just trying to take something from the board and put it on a piece of paper.
Sure.
There's no comprehension, no understanding.
And then we're adding a time constraint. So then you've got the pressure on the brain of, I've got to do this in the next 2 minutes because then the board's going to change.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Another example of pressure on working memory is when we teach people rules and ask them to apply these rules. Because working memory isn't only memory, it's the application of what you've just learned.
Okay. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so for instance, I have a great memory for what I was doing when I was a child, or I have a great memory for where I was this day in 1987, because I remember I was walking in the hills.
Okay.
But my working memory suffers when somebody says, okay, here's a rule, now remember this rule and apply it to something else. So remember this language rule and apply it and use this so that you can now speak this language.
So then using things across different
100%.
is really different sort of factions of life, if you like,
Absolutely.
are really difficult.
100%, 100%. And so what you're asking people to remember things in the short term and then use them. And actually this is quite a complex task. This is quite a complex task going on up there. And people who have poor working memory will struggle like that.
So the other thing I see in the classrooms that I visit and with the children that I talk to and work with is that quite often they're, because of how they have a sense of self or a lack of a sense of self as a learner in a classroom situation, this in itself is quite limiting. So if young people don't feel successful in their learning, then their self-esteem is lower, and then they've got even further to be able to rise up, to be able to complete tasks. That sense of self is so important, and the sense of safety and emotional regulation in the classroom in itself can impact on executive functioning. So you've got a further issue there. If you've got a dyslexic learner who is struggling with certain tasks or activities, has a low sense of self as a learner, is hearing messages that they're not quick enough, they're lazy, things aren't going well, then actually their executive functioning is then being further impacted because they are trying to cope with more, and then that's impacting the kind of cognitive processes of the brain.
It puts more pressure on them.
Absolutely.
And do you think there's something about learned helplessness here?
I think so, and one of the things that I have found most helpful in schools is actually to do some sort of flipped learning or pre-teaching. So if you do a little bit of pre-teaching with a child and you give them some tips about what's coming up in the learning, and then they feel, oh, I already know something, I feel successful in the lesson, and then you can follow that up with post-teaching, and it only needs to be very short. So a little 5-minute session, this is what we're going to be doing in the lesson. Then that young person feels empowered, they feel enabled, and then they can show what they're actually capable of.
And this fits perfectly with the idea of prediction and planning, which is affected by executive function skills. Yeah, now, this is a really interesting idea because often it's difficult to categorize something as simply literacy or not literacy.
Yeah.
One of the main challenges I've always faced is that because I read and write slowly, it means that I can get less done. So
Okay.
I actually faced less success when I was at university because I couldn't go to the webinars, I couldn't go to the seminars, I couldn't go to the colloquia because I hadn't done all the other things I needed to do.
Okay.
And that was really impactful. In my current work, when I collaborate with people, sometimes I can be a little bit slow. When I'm reading and writing, it takes me a little bit longer. Now, that slowness with reading and writing is to do with literacy, but actually the impact goes beyond literacy.
Okay.
Then there's the other aspect, which is that what's really interesting is that we know from the research that dyslexics and kids with ADHD, actually they have a greater emotional sensitivity than what we might loosely call neurotypical
Yeah.
children. And this greater emotional sensitivity impacts them and it impacts their learning.
Yeah.
At the same time, one of the aspects of executive function, which we just mentioned, was regulation, and this is emotional regulation. So we find it harder to regulate our emotions.
And I think it's useful to talk here about the window of tolerance. So we all have I don't know, you might call it a bucket, or spoon theory, whatever you want to call it, but we've all got a window of tolerance of where we are at our optimum, where we are able to learn and interact. And unfortunately, that is chipped away at by different things. And I think for neurodivergent young people and adults, I think that sense of feeling things a lot more, that sense of that emotional regulation being chipped away at means that the window of tolerance is reduced, the executive functioning then becomes more tricky. And I think I don't know whether you'd agree, but I think it's really important to look at bullying.
Yeah,
to look
definitely.
at the fact that actually bullying, whilst as adults we can look at a situation and think, well, yes, bullying is unkind, it's not nice, but it's just bullying. But actually it's it's having a huge impact on these young people, and their sense of self, their self as a learner, their sense of belonging in the classroom and being successful. And I think that again is another factor beyond literacy that affects a lot of young people.
Very much so. Neurodivergent children are bullied roughly about 3 times as much as non-neurodivergent children. And when they find that emotional pain hard to react to, it can bring about forms of trauma as well.
And we know what trauma does to the brain. So we know that actually when young people are in survival mode, fight, flight, freeze, whatever, or they're masking, so they're essentially pretending that things are going okay and that they're coping and it's all okay. Actually, that again is that's actually stopping the brain from being able to process information. It's stopping the brain from being able to be as effective in its executive functioning. And
this lets these kids fall further and further behind at school. And then the stigma of it's your fault comes back again and again.
So the support can't be just in literacy, it can't be just in those areas. It's got to be also whole child, it's got to be, sense of self, self-belief, all of those things.
there are some really interesting gifts that dyslexic kids have. Now, what we're not saying is, oh, dyslexic kids, they're not very good at this. Let's be kind to them and claim that they're good at other things. There's some really solid research to show that dyslexic subjects, dyslexic people, that can be children and adults, are more creative and measurably more creative than non-dyslexics. There's been a number of studies to show this. One in particular took a word which I'm not particularly comfortable with, gifted. So they'd take gifted non-dyslexics, gifted dyslexics, and non-gifted dyslexics. Now, regardless of what we think about that word gifted, they tested each group of these kids on creativity tests and found that the group that came out worst was the gifted non-dyslexics. So even the non-gifted dyslexics did better than the gifted non-dyslexics on this creativity test. There's also a lot of evidence to suggest that dyslexic people are really good at interpersonal problem solving. And there's reasons for that, because dyslexics are good at seeing secondary information, taking secondary information more than non-dyslexics. And there is this idea that perhaps because dyslexics don't learn by reading and writing in that solitary way, they adapt and become far more interpersonal in how they engage with subject matter. So we know that dyslexics come out as more intelligent, creatively intelligent than non-dyslexics. There's very strong evidence to suppose that, or to show that dyslexics are also extremely good at interpersonal problem solving. And there's some good evidence to suggest that dyslexics have got great visual skills. They can visualize things in different ways from non-dyslexics and represent things visually.
Okay, so can you explain that? That's interesting, that concept.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I became quite well known for on LinkedIn was my visual representations of dyslexia. I took the idea of a London Underground map. And I took the tube lines, the subway lines of this underground map, and said that, okay, this is phonological decoding, this is working memory, this is creativity, this is what they call material reasoning, another aspect of dyslexia, and they intersect here and they intersect like this. And people could understand what dyslexia was without me having to write down paragraphs and paragraphs of close, detailed information. They could just see the visualization that I was trying to do.
So by that notion, is it useful to support dyslexic learners with visual tools in that way? Is it useful to create infographics in the classroom?
100%. And remember, when we create infographics, there's something which I'd like to talk about called embedded imagery. Now, embedded imagery, the idea of the underground map is a very good example. If you just have an infographic that has nothing to do with the message you're trying to push, then it doesn't have the same impact as an infographic that does have something to do with the message you're trying to push. So let's give a very simple example. If you're trying to teach what the letter D looks like, it might be a nice idea to have a cute dog with his tail in the air, and it looks like a D, because D for dog. So you've got that embedded imagery there.
So going back to strengths of dyslexics, how do you buy into this superpower notion? What are your thoughts on that?
When we think about superheroes, we always think about outcasts, people who are different from others. It's not fair to separate people. At the same time, when I was at school, I didn't realise that I had dyslexia, and I didn't realise that I had any strengths. I just struggled with the work that I was given at school. And if, as a dyslexic child, I'd thought I was dyslexic, but still wasn't doing well at school, it would have made me feel even worse, because I'm supposed to have a superpower. And that's quite a difficult thing.
So it becomes a pressure for some people.
It becomes a lot of pressure for some people.
And it's kind of othering again,
It's othering, it's divisive. So the idea of saying that dyslexic kids have got superpowers, I think, is a little bit dangerous. What we can say is that dyslexic kids have gifts that other kids don't have, in the same way that they have struggles that other kids don't have.
You know, and it's the same for ADHD, and I think we also see it when people say, oh, you know, ADHDs make great entrepreneurs. But again, then there's the pressure. Well, I'm not an entrepreneur, you know, I'm not an entrepreneur. Oh my goodness, I'm not doing as well as other people with ADHD. And then it becomes, because one of the things that obviously those with ADHD have is that negative constant spiral of thoughts. And so it's another stick to beat yourself with. It's another thing that, oh, you know, I should be able to do this. Why can't I do that? So it's it's about sort of discovering your own self kind of confidence and,
Yeah.
and the things that you're good at.
And this is really important for the teacher who creates a classroom environment where people can feel comfortable in who they are and they can feel as though they belong. Because
Yeah.
belonging is really important to learning. And you can't feel as though you belong if people are telling you who you are and
Yeah.
you're not achieving that.
Sure. Right, so we're going to have a little focus on ADHD for a minute, and we're going to think about some of the adaptations that can be put in place quite straightforward. One of the first thing, and you alluded to this, you talked about this before, is about that sense of belonging, that sense of psychological safety or emotional safety in a classroom situation. So it's about making that classroom feel welcoming and safe for all. Not welcoming if you do it this way, or you're welcome here as long as you don't, as long as you don't move around too much, as long as you don't, and it's difficult for teachers because there's an expectation that, children sit still, that there's a certain amount of work. But I think we need to understand that it's not, the key thing is it's not that young person won't, it's actually that young person can't sit still. It's not that young person won't stop fiddling with the pen. It's that actually fiddling with the pen helps that young person to think about what it is you're asking them.
To regulate themselves.
Exactly. So when we look at some of these behaviours that can be frustrating for teachers, and we think about how actually that regulating, not everyone is regulated sitting still. Not everyone is learning well or making progress when sitting still. Actually, some learners need to move around and need to have those brain breaks. And it's not a case of, okay, so you've got to do this for 5 minutes and then you can have a break. It's about really kind of understanding that individual learner and thinking, you know what, that if that young learner has regular breaks, then actually that will help them to get into a pattern and a flow.
So this reminds me of the UNESCO decision to create child-centred education rather than process-centred education or outcome-centred education. And it sounds like you're saying one of the things we should do is stop blaming kids.
I think so, because again, then that is going to impact on them feeling psychologically safe in the classroom. Because if the messages that you're receiving all the time are negatives, I actually was, just at the weekend, I was in a newsagent and I was watching a father with his 2 children. I'm not criticising the father per se, but one of the children was clearly struggling with regulation, so whether that child had ADHD, but in that period of 5 minutes, that dad, probably because he felt the pressure of the environment and people looking at his child, was reinforcing the message to that child, no, stop, don't do it, let go of that, hold on to this. And in that 5 minute period, one of his children, and I'm sure that he doesn't even realise this happened, received something in the region of about 25 negative messages, and the other child didn't. And I think we just need to be aware as teachers of what our communication might be saying when we're not meaning it to say it. So one of the other things I want to say that teachers can do really quickly and really easily without a huge amount of effort is to keep their communication slow and low. So slower communication, but also lower the pitch and sometimes lower the volume, come in closer, because actually there's something about the higher pitch that impacts the brain to feel a sense of urgency, to feel a sense of alarm, that reduces that window of tolerance. And a lot of the children with ADHD that I work with here in the UK say to me, they just want to feel like the teacher likes them. Yeah. They just want to build a trusted relationship because they feel like they're not wanted, they're a bit too much. Their style of learning isn't acceptable. And I think that an ADHD child will make a quite a quick decision about whether or not that adult wants them there. And if they feel the adult does want them there, then they will build that trusted relationship. So I would say it's always really useful because this also uses up some of that excess energy. is the moment a learner comes in the classroom, welcome them and say, oh, could you do a job for me?
Yeah.
I really need these books handed out around the classroom.
Yeah.
I really need these pencils sharpened. It would be so amazing if you could help me, because A, you're saying, I want you here. B, you're saying, actually, you're useful to me. And C, you're saying, let's get rid of some of that energy. I do want to just mention as well, we have this notion that children with ADHD are always the ones that are bouncing around. They're often the ones that are behaving in a way that is, to us, challenging. I would say sometimes if you think about language, think about some of those behaviours as being distressed rather than challenging, because that young person is communicating what's going on for them. But actually, it's really important to recognise that ADHD isn't always in the classroom in that way. So there will be learners who are masking. So there will be learners who are not making progress in their learning, not answering the questions, not being part of what's going on, who may have ADHD, who are shutting down, who are withdrawing, who are struggling to attend, because actually they know they can't meet that expectation, so they're just trying to be invisible. I think we're learning more and more about this, particularly people talk about how it looks very different in girls than it does in boys, but even that I find quite damaging, because I certainly know young male learners who have that profile whereby the busyness, if you like, the noise, the activity is in the head, so it's internalised.
Yeah.
So some of the things as teachers that we can do in the classroom, we can chunk learning. So we can break it down into manageable chunks. We can give really clear success criteria. So by that, this is a successful piece of work. This is what it looks like. You're not cheating. Yeah. You're saying, this is what I want. These are the steps. So for that executive functioning, these are the different steps. This is how you can achieve it. And actually what you're also is helpful, particularly for ADHD, is you're saying, right, you've got this long to do it, because there is that notion of procrastination, and that's not just for ADHD, as we know. Yeah.
And of course the procrastination often comes from the emotional dysregulation as well.
Exactly. So, but the other thing I would say is to try and find the hook. So in order to find a young person's flow, actually you've got to make the work feel relevant. You've got to make the work feel interesting. And
you've got to make the work connected.
Yeah. We know that the ADHD brain is wired differently, and it will seek out things that it wants to do, and it will not do the things it doesn't want to do. And that's an actual, we've seen brain scans and we know that that is the case. So it's about trying to work with your learners in the classroom to find what the hook is, and then, as you've said, to make it relevant
and cumulative.
Cumulative, yeah, absolutely. The other thing I think teachers are concerned with sometimes is showing a finished piece of work. Is showing a finished piece of work cheating? Is showing a finished piece of work a negative thing? But actually it's not. You're saying, this is the model. This is the model of what I want you to achieve, and now this is how I want you. These are the steps I want you to be able to achieve it with.
And just to put some context to that, that's exactly what happened with me when I was doing my doctorate. That I was struggling with a particular type of work, and my supervisor said, "This is a very good example of it. Have a look at that and basically copy it." Yeah. But put your own ideas into these categories and into these sections. As soon as I'd done that and it worked, I knew what I was doing and I knew how to do it, and I was off.